Well, welcome everybody. We'll get started. It's always the last session of the day, right? This is always the one everybody loves to be at, and it's always fun to be the presenter for, because everybody's so into this at this point, just ready to just be here and learn more, but not exactly. So we'll try to get through this material information, but I think you might find it interesting and maybe entertaining. I don't know, that's not the right thing to say, but as we know, many of the public hearings that we attend, they are indeed entertaining for a variety of reasons, and not all of them good. But as you can see, I actually borrowed the title of this session from this story that was written by Jerusalem Dempsey in the Atlantic magazine. And it's an excellent story. If you haven't had a chance to read it, it really has some interesting comments and some insights about this whole process that we call public input, public hearings, whatever it is, and for us, particularly in the land use process. Before we kind of dive into it, I thought it might be good just to show you the emphasis that has been placed on this, or the attention that it's getting these days. You know that this is becoming a social icon, or trending culturally when you start getting cartoons about stuff, right? So we have some cartoons here that relate to this. So I'll give you just a second to look over those and see how they fit. Probably some of the sentiment, many of you who have been involved in land use processes before, you hear things like this, I am certain. So what does it really mean for us? I've been involved in land use for 39 years now. As I continue to work with the Land Use Institute, I'm going into the 40 plus years of working on this stuff. And I've had my fair share of hearings and public input sessions and so on, and it's been interesting. I didn't know what to make of them at first, but over time you kind of learn a little bit more about them. And there's some good to them, there's some bad to them, there's a lot of, but how does it really fit in? What really is the role here for how we do public input and take public comment and have public hearings with regard to our land use processes? What I've got on these slides, these are some actual comments that were provided, and you probably will have seen some that are way worse than this, but this kind of gives you a little bit of the tone, I think a little bit of the flavor of the kinds of things that get said in these public meetings. I've got this, I've got another one. And the point of this really is to, if you were here at the sessions earlier this morning, you remember some of the comments that were made as we talked a little bit about NIMBYism and about the role of the public sometimes and their unwillingness to consider or to accept the kinds of land use proposals or concepts that are being presented before us. And a lot of it really seems to have to do with fear of change. People are just afraid, or they don't want things to change. And you kind of can pick that up from these comments, which I think are very exemplary of the kind of things that people will say, mainly I think because they're afraid. They're worried about change. They don't want to see things change. Well, that's not how life works. We know that. Just by virtue of the fact that we're growing, things are going to change. And the question becomes more, how are they going to change? How should they change? What should we be doing to make things a little different and hopefully better than maybe what we've had before, or at least not worse? And so we have to take some more proactive steps with regard to that. But I want to go over now that, as I say, this has been an issue or a topic that has been of kind of top of mind for a number of people in a variety of different fields for a good period of time now. And there's been some interesting research done with this. And so let's just go over a few of the things that we've got here. This is a book written by a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, Jenny Schutz, just a recently book. And this is a great quote. What she says are kind of exemplary. It's, "We have this system where local governments are the gatekeepers for new housing production," she says. "Local governments, in turn, have outsourced a lot of their authority to existing residents. So existing homeowners in particular have essential veto power over proposals to build new housing. You know, by whatever means that happens, but that kind of seems to be the case. That kind of seems to be what's happening. This is from another story in the Atlantic, another piece by Derek Thompson. It's called "Why Your House is So Expensive." And he goes through a variety of different factors. They're listed there in the subtitle, you know, cost inflation, anti-building rules, he says, barriers to innovation. He talks about supply chain issues, financing and interest in a variety of issues, but a lot of it has to do, he says, with NIMBY attitudes and anti-building. And he says an interesting thing. He says researchers sometimes call this phenomenon the citizen voice. And he goes on, he says, he says, because I like citizens and I like their voices, I don't like this term. He calls it the vetocracy, which is, I think, kind of an interesting term for it. But he says, you might say there's nothing wrong with people offering feedback on construction that will affect their neighborhood. Isn't this just democracy in action? Well, no, he says. Democracy is government by the people, all of them. By contrast, local vetocracy is government by a very small group yelling loudly with their lawyer on speed dial. When you turn over governance to the most litigious shouters, you implicitly allow older and richer homeowners to block construction for younger, poorer renters. That's not a recipe for housing abundance, it's a recipe for the status quo. You know, this is the kind of stuff that's being written. Now, is there any truth to what he's saying here? Because in his story here, he talks about, he says, you're implicitly allowing older and richer homeowners to block construction for younger and poorer renters. Is there truth to that? Well, here's a piece. Here's a study that was done over a period of years by a group. The lead author, her name is Catherine Levine Einstein. What a name, right? How can you not believe what she writes? But this is what she says. This is what their research showed. The traditional justification for public meetings about zoning is that commenters represent the public. The authors disprove this idea. Commenters that zoning meetings are much more likely to be homeowners as opposed to renters, and are whiter, older, and more male. In the towns surveyed, 73% of commenters were homeowners as opposed to 46% of all voters in the community. Only 5% of the commenters were non-white as opposed to 13% of all the voters. Non-whites were generally more pro-housing than whites. Just under 15% of white commenters supported new housing as opposed to 45% of minorities. This is the sampling of the people who made comments in public meetings, public hearings. And so really what this is intended to demonstrate is those that come to public meetings, public hearings, and express their opinions are generally not representative of the community as a whole.
Is this United States, Utah?
This is, most of this was done in New England. Most of this study was carried out in New England. I think there's been some ancillary work done that shows that it applies in other areas as well. But this particular study was done in the New England area. All right. So just some background, some information. Now I want to talk a little bit more about some things that maybe get us a little closer to home. This is from a local Utah news story. And this begins to give you a flavor of some of the kinds of issues that we face. This was a development proposal review by a council, by the city council. Responding to comments, the applicant explained 348 parking spots in the proposal already meet and go above the city code requirement of 335 parking stalls for this project. But I took the name out. The councilor maintained his position that there still needed to be more parking spaces for private residents. After an hour of logistical sparring, the council member settled on approving the proposal if the applicant added 24 additional parking units. The applicant agreed to 20, which the rest of the council then approved. What's wrong with this? Everything. I mean, isn't this the kind of stuff that people say, well, that's why we have public meetings, you know? This is why we want to get this, because we need to get things sorted out so that it works better in our community, in our neighborhood. what's wrong with this? Take a look at the first line of that story. What does it say there? He says he provided the number of parking stalls that were required, right? And yet you had one of the council members saying, yeah, but you heard all the people here. You need more. You need more than that. Why did the applicant not just say, forget you, I'm just taking you to court? Could have done that, right, Wade?
Oh, yeah.
I should, and I
I'll
have to
explain why that's a
apologize.
bad idea in a minute.
Yeah. I did not start by introducing Wilf Sommerkorn, retired planner, been around for a while doing this kind of stuff, working now with the Land Use Institute. Wade Budge, Snell and Wilmer, works a lot on land use issues. Paul Allred, former Holladay City Planning Director, and a number of other places, including he and I worked together for a period of time. And Paul and I are both on the Kaysville Planning Commission at this point also. Paul is also retired, so you get kind of two old has-beens and a legal guy. But anyway, yeah, I mean, you get to this point here, you know, and why would he just not go to court about this? I mean, I think he clearly would probably prevail because he meets the requirements of the ordinance. It'd be pretty easy to waltz into a judge and say, Judge, here's our ordinance, I meet the provisions, I was entitled to approval. Jamie?
Well, and it reinforces the notion that everything's negotiable.
Yeah.
Which is obviously that's the point of the ordinance.
Yeah.
Well, you often see this sort of thing though, when the developer, the applicant is asking for concessions, some kind of
Sure.
conditional use or something.
Right. Yep, that is very true. Greg?
Until a couple of years ago, I worked in private practice. Now I work for South Jordan. But I would tell my client that if you have to go to court, you will not get justice at the district court. You will have to go to one of the appellate courts before you get somebody that really takes a close enough look and understands the law to be able to do it. So in this case, it's probably going to be less expensive to add the 24 parking spots.
And to go through the whole legal
Go
process.
through the whole.
And the time spent and the interest paid and the.
Yeah, and I saw that, you know, over and over, that they usually got their contract signed and they're ready to let the bulldozers roll, and this is all they're waiting for.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
and if you don't mind, let me just add one other
Sure,
comment. Now
please go
that I've
ahead.
been in the city for a couple of years, and in that 2 years, I've attended every single one of the planning commission meetings that are held twice a month in a city that's growing very rapidly. And in administrative hearings, I've never once heard anything but public clamor. I've never heard a piece of evidence.
On
I've never had
administrative
the
issues.
public come, on administrative issues. You know, they're supposed to present substantial evidence.
Right.
And I've never seen somebody come in with a study or anything like that.
Yeah.
But it's hard for my planning commissioners to get in their head that, you know, that they can't consider all that.
And now, what do you do? You know, I've been a planner for 40 plus years. Paul's been a planner for a long time. We've got Greg, who's now a city attorney. There are other city attorneys here, other planners. You're the staff person. You know the rules. You're in a meeting and this happens. What do you do as a staff person? You're probably sitting there going, this ain't right. You shouldn't be doing this. Well, what do you do, John?
No, I was raising my hand.
Oh, you're saying you're one of those. Well, you've had this happen. Yeah, something like that. I mean, what do you do?
Place on the next agenda, removing the legislative body from making an initiative.
Fair point. Well, okay, that may be true of the legislative body. Does this happen with planning commissions too, when they're acting as a land use authority? Yeah, it does. It does. You know, so, I mean, it's a tough issue. It's a really an interesting situation. Oh, boy, I lost the ability to advance the, oh, there it goes. All right. Let me go back. All right. In order to talk about this, because a lot of the hearings or a lot of the comments that I've shown you and that you've heard over the period of time have been for different things. A lot of them you hear about things mainly like rezones, right? You hear a lot of those things on rezones. But we get them on conditional uses too, get them on general plan. We need to understand there's a difference here. There's a difference in the kind of actions that we're taking and how public comment and public input works. Most of you know this stuff, so I'll go over this fairly quickly. There are two major types, or two main types of land use actions, a legislative and an administrative. The legislative kinds of actions, they're policy things. This is where you're trying to decide, is this a good idea for the city, for the community? Is this how we should do things? Is this what we should do? And those are things like the adoption of your general plan, of the land use ordinances, zonings or rezonings of property, annexations of property. And then we have administrative actions. Those are once you've set your rules. You've zoned the property, you've got your codes and ordinances in place, and now somebody comes in seeking a permit to do something that your ordinance allows. And you're reviewing this now to see, does it conform with the requirements of our code or of our ordinance? Those are things like the issuance of building permits, though we hardly ever do any kind of public comment on that. But site plan reviews, conditional use permits, that's a big one. We do a lot of those. Subdivision reviews, that's another fairly big one. Just really any kind of land use condition or approval. These two actions have different rules, if you can call them rules, different ways that public input applies and how it should work in those actions. For administrative actions, something very clear. We have a couple of court cases in the state of Utah. And here's the quotes from them. The opposition of neighbors is not one of the considerations to be taken into account when determining whether to issue a development permit. By the way, Davis County versus Clearfield City, very near and dear to my heart. I was the planner in that situation. For both the county and the city. I was not actually for the county, I was working for the county, but the county had contracts with a number of the communities throughout the county to provide them planning services. And I was the planner assigned to be Clearfield City's planner. So Clearfield was taking this action. I was their planner advising them. The county, who in this particular case was the applicant for a mental health facility, the county then challenged that. And I mean, I actually worked for the county, so talk about an interesting type of content. But yeah, so.
No wonder you're retired.
Yeah. Yes. Another quote here: consent of neighboring landowners may not be made a criterion for the issuance or denial of a conditional use permit. This is just general criteria or general guidance for the courts telling us what's appropriate for an administrative action. All right? Now, I'm going to, from the School of Government at the University of North Carolina, some interesting stuff. This is their professor here, David Owens, talking about administrative hearings. Land use issues, administrative land use issue hearings, and he talks about these. He says, it's important to remember the purpose of evidentiary zoning hearings. Unlike legislative hearings, they are not designed to solicit broad public opinion about how the board should vote on the matter. Rather, they provide an opportunity for the board to gather facts it needs to apply policies already set in the ordinance. Therefore, the standards on gathering evidence are much more strict than they are for legislative hearings. This includes decision on variances, all the stuff that we talked about before, all right? How often in a public hearing do you get facts from the public? Every once in a while. I will say that, you know, every once in a while. Mostly, what do you get? Opinions, feelings. We don't like this. I have the three things that I hear in every public hearing, whether it's legislative or administrative, I don't care what it is. When we have a public hearing, I almost always hear three things. It's going to lower my property values. It's going to increase traffic. It's going to kill children. Okay? Hear that every time.
And there's no water.
Well, and nowadays we're adding, that there's no water to that, right? Exactly. Since the purpose of an evidentiary hearing is to carefully gather relevant facts to aid in decision-making, restrictions on what can be heard and how it can be heard are applied to these types of hearings. This is what they do in North Carolina. It is inappropriate in an evidentiary hearing to consider non-expert personal opinions or hearsay testimony. All right? So really what he's saying here is that we ought to maybe think about treating our hearings or our public input for land use administrative items differently than we do for legislative items, because there's a different purpose behind them and a different set of things that we're trying to accomplish here. So maybe the rules ought to be different for those kinds of hearings. This is from Fordham Law Review. This is, again, where part of the title of the session comes from, Overparticipation, Designing Effective Land Use Public Processes. It says evidentiary hearings are public, but not generally open to public participation. That's not true in many of our instances. We do still oftentimes have public hearings for administrative items. One may seek to intervene if the applicable statute expressly permits, so on and so on. The Model State APA requires that evidence be relevant and material. The presiding officer may exclude evidence if the evidence is irrelevant, immaterial, unduly repetitious, or excludable on constitutional or statutory grounds. Kind of setting the ground rules for how administrative hearings should work. So this is kind of stuff that we get from a variety of different sources telling us how these kinds of hearings would work. Now, to demonstrate again the kinds of issues that we face with administrative land use issues, this came just within the last couple of weeks out of the Salt Lake Tribune about a proposal in Salt Lake City where I worked for 6 years, near and dear to my heart. Paul worked there as well. But this is for a conditional use permit. All right, keep that in mind. That's an administrative action. The first quote we have, a council member, a member of the council saying, reflecting on the constituent sentiments, as well as her own personal views, she said, this is not what is wanted. It is not the best use for that corner. That's not the question in front of you. Why are we even at this point with this project if it's a conditional use project, this particular person asked in an interview? No one in the community is for it, and that seems to be enough of a condition. This is a conditional use? Well, nobody wants it. Remember those court cases I cited back there? City's criteria for reviewing the project, the Park Authority's board president wrote, requires it to decide whether the gas station matches the character of site and is consistent with adjacent uses. This is general language in the code that oftentimes gets it into trouble because it's too general. All right, but it's there. It's in many of your codes because it was put there long ago. And it's still in Salt Lake City's. And for heaven's sake, Salt Lake City ought to know better. But I can say that having worked there for 6 years and I didn't fix it. The gas station's proposed use, she said, cannot meet those requirements. Well, by whose judgment can it not meet those requirements? And we actually have a provision in state code now that says, based on a couple of previous court cases, that says because of the importance of property rights in the state of Utah, that if you have a provision or a criterion that can be interpreted reasonably different ways, then the interpretation is to follow that of the property owner, the applicant. All right? So if that's the case, when you have something that's so broad and unspecific as this, if it can be generally interpreted a number of ways, you're required by state code now to follow what the property owner thinks in such broad circumstances. Council member, meanwhile, has vowed to vote against the come and go proposal if it comes before the council. But as a conditional use permit, it turns out that's unlikely to happen. All right? So these are the kind of challenges that we face in administrative land use actions and where we go with those. I have instigated, along with a number of other folks, a discussion about maybe we need to have some clarification in the state code. In the state code, we have a section that talks about the planning commission, what its duties and powers are, and what it's supposed to be doing. We have a section that talks about the appeal authority and what it's supposed to do, but we don't have any specific section that talks about the land use authority. And the land use authority, under our state code, is what makes administrative land use decisions. There are little bits and pieces scattered around here and there in the state code, and it's not even that comprehensive. So I kind of thought this idea, and I started writing this up, a new Part 10 to the LUDMA, which would better define what the land use authority is, what it's supposed to do, and how it does it, including how you do administrative land use hearings. That was appreciated by many, and it kicked off a discussion about what maybe should happen this coming legislative session in light of a variety of things that are going on. Now, let me just tell you folks, this next legislative session ought to be really interesting from the land use perspective, because there's a lot of stuff happening out there right now. Now, I mentioned this to somebody and they said, oh, you say that every year, Will. Well, there's some truth to that, but there really is some really interesting stuff going on right now. So I'm gonna kick it over to Wade right now, who's gonna talk a little bit about some more of the specifics about maybe what we could and should do with regard to how we handle administrative land use issues.
So Paul and Wilf and I did this presentation about a month and a half ago for the APA, and it was good. We learned some things from that presentation and incorporated some additions. But one of the things we've learned is that this very much is a growing problem. It's not going away. And when you deal with it, you really have to deal with what are the core issues that's causing the issue. And I like what Wilf has identified. I think the studies are helpful. They show us that there's really an imbalance in terms of the kind of input you get. It's not the high quality input that makes a project better. But one of the things you may wonder is, well, why would someone like me, who's always representing developers and gets paid by the hour, want to make meetings shorter? And the reason is, this is a huge waste. If we're sitting there listening to these long, long hearings, and it's extremely low value information, and it many times causes decision makers to make bad decisions out of either fear or misunderstanding or confusion, that's not good for any of us in this room. And so this is what I've really liked, is that when Wilf proposed this topic for the APA, I said, yeah, this is one we absolutely can support. And so what I'm seeing, and this is what I'm advocating, and then we'll talk a little bit about what the land use task force is thinking about. But you really have to think about what is the origin of the confusion, and when you think about it, when you ask a planning commission, which is not an elected body, it's an appointed body, to come in and start holding public hearings, you're really you're creating confusion for them. Many times they think they're now a mini city council, and they're there to act like the junior league or the junior version of the city council. And some of them, as you know, are auditioning for that while they're there planning commission. And when they're there to perform a different role, which is to make decisions on administrative applications, that's not helpful. That kind of posturing and that kind of action is not what we need. What we need is people focused on the task and looking at the evidence and determining how to apply the rules that have been prepared. On the other hand of the spectrum, I do recognize that there can be a role for public input when you're dealing with legislative. I think a lot of what Wilf identified, though, could apply to say that maybe legislative type hearings shouldn't be in the same way that they have been traditionally. But what I'm going to focus my comments on today is the administrative and why there needs to be such a change in that area. And I like how Wilf identified the bingo card that we land use lawyers and planners, it sounds like, also carry around to these hearings. I'll just add, and you listed all the ones that Bruce Baird handed me when he handed me his bingo card and said this is it, but I'll add one more. The one that we sometimes also add in addition to your three is, my realtor told me something would never be built. So that's the other one. But when you're thinking about trying to get high value comments, what you really want to do is change everybody's perspective to say the place to go and provide your comments is when a general plan is being evaluated, or when you're talking about a zoning district and what types of uses should be in that zoning district. Because what you're not doing in that instance is you're not talking about the individual, and you're not turning zoning into a popularity contest. Because one of the things we all have to remember is this: zoning is supposed to be available to all and based on evidence and based on the standards. And if instead we turn it into something where we value public clamor and we let only the popular develop, then that erodes confidence in the whole system we're trying to do. I mean, if you think about it at some sort of lawyerly level, right, and I'll hurry get off this soapbox in like 10 seconds, but when we're dealing with private property rights, those are constitutional based rights. And when you're dealing with zoning, that's not a constitutional structure, that's a statutory structure. So we need to make sure that that functions well and doesn't overwhelm those private property rights. And so one of the things we're talking about doing is going out and communicating to all who are involved in this process, those who like to show up to the public hearings And those of us who bring development applications, and those of us who advise planning staff, and those of us who sit in the chair of being planning commissioners, that if you're in an administrative role, you shouldn't have a public hearing. So what do? Well, public comment still could be of value, but you can provide in your notice, provide written comment 7, 10 days in advance. What that does is that allows city staff to look at those public comments. It allows the applicant to do that. They can provide a response. And this isn't new. When you're dealing with federal land use, that's actually the way they do federal land use. And so if you think about it, there are a lot more in the way of advantages to adopting a system along those lines than disadvantages. Because those who are uniquely situated still have a way to influence it, and that's through raising those comments. And out of the hundreds of hearings I've been to, I will admit that in a few of those, there have been a few public comments that have been helpful. But those could have easily have been submitted in writing and achieved the same, if not better, result. And what we want to avoid is a system where people are up there feeling that they're responding to the mob, and they start making trades that are bad for all of us involved. And so that's one of the things that we wanted to identify. Now, I like what Chris Ambrose, in anticipation of this presentation, sent me a little quote, and I really like this. I hadn't heard this. But if we focus a lot on public comment and trying to enable public comment, we're oftentimes empowering what he titled, and I'm giving you full credit because this is well done, the dictatorship of the articulate. And that is not really helpful when we're trying to achieve a better result for the community. And instead, what we need to be doing is thinking about how can we curb localism, how can we educate those who want to be involved in this process and explain there is a role. It's up front, it's when you're doing the rules. And if you end up seeing an application turn out the way you didn't want it, well, another application could be behind it. So go and talk to your folks about a legislative change, but don't try to rework those rules after the fact, because that goes against everything we've established in the system about rules being set up and then those rules being applied. And I'll just close these remarks with just this comment, and that is, well, and then I'm going to talk about this land use task force, but the comment is this, is when you think about it, we need to make sure that we're building faith in the system and that people don't feel like the results are arbitrary. And the way that we can all be involved in that is by making sure that people are not, either if they're a decision maker, and I agree with the comment that was over here about legislative, elected officials should never, ever act on administrative applications. I agree with that because it's too hard for them to go between those two hats. But if they are in that position, they have to understand that they don't value public comment in the same way, because there's a risk that you'll start to erode faith in that whole system because they'll see arbitrary results. But when we've taken this concept to the land use task force, and nothing's set in stone, but we thought we'd give this group, since all of you are very much involved in this at some level or many levels, a preview. It appears that for this upcoming session, the focus has been more on subdivisions. That's a type of administrative process, and the idea would be to remove the public hearings for subdivisions, and that would be a state standard that would be imposed. And the idea would be to make it so that there would be actually a really specified process. It's looking currently like you do a preliminary plat review with a final plat review to follow. But the idea is to build in more consistency, because nothing's worse, and Chris and others in here can give a million stories, than bringing in a subdivision application and being told you have to have 4 public hearings. And that has happened. Sometimes people will make up a community council, you gotta go deal with them, and then you gotta go to the planning commission and maybe get a table, and so you have to do them twice, and then some will say, oh, we gotta have another hearing at the legislative body. And that is a huge amount of cost, it's a huge amount of delay for bringing product to the market, and it's something where we're doing a disservice to those who might be actually good-natured and really wanna make things better and wanna show up, because we're telling them that their public comments matter at this stage when they really don't in that same way. And so we want everybody to be working from the same set of understandings and understand that, you know, we want to encourage our thoughtful comments, but not encourage a system that rewards clamorous comments or comments that are based on clamor. I don't know, anything else you wanted me to touch on? I actually do have to leave in 10 minutes because I have a planning commission meeting. It starts at 5. Who starts them at 5? Smart. So I'm going to sneak out, Paul, during yours, but anyway.
You know this, you know.
No.
Oh, thanks, Wade.
Yeah.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, please do.
So, and I guess it's more like some constructive comment, maybe more even than a question. We happen to have really good planning commission commissioners in the city where I work, so, I don't know if it's really representative of a lot of cities or most cities or some cities, but they do a really good job of staying on track and keeping in mind what comments they should be, weighing, you know, on one side of the,
Yep.
and what comments are more just something that is to be heard. But I think oftentimes the planning commission meeting is a really good forum for the members of the public who maybe don't have a good understanding
Right.
of the project, and they have questions, or they have concerns, or they're worried, and they need some, you know, they would like to get some answers, they would like to be able to have the applicant respond directly to the questions that they have. They would like to be able to have staff respond to the question while everyone is there and seeing the same plan up on the
Yeah.
screen. And oftentimes I think that the residents have the opportunity to feel heard, even if they were promoting a different decision, or they would have preferred a different decision. And sometimes their comments are about, you know, a wall or a fence, or where you're gonna put your parking lot light or something. And oftentimes I think it provides an opportunity for the applicant to do a minor revision, whereas they might not, the neighbors might not have otherwise been as receptive to the applicant trying to work those things out with them outside of that planning commission.
Yeah, and a lot of that may be accomplished depending on how you structure the hearing or the meeting. And, you know, be able to at least explain to residents, say, look, you know, if they meet all of our requirements, we're obligated to approve them, we're reviewing the requirements. And if you have some questions, we're happy to answer those, but understand that if they meet our requirements, we need to go ahead and go through with this. And, you know, doing something like that certainly could help, but that may be something to look at. It's certainly an option. Carson?
I just wanted to clarify that the concept we've been talking about at the Land Use Task Force at a high level does leave the option for public comments sort of at the preliminary stage.
Yeah.
Just moves it to there and takes it away from the final stage. That's really administrative. So
Yeah.
I saw some city folks cringe a little bit. So just
Yeah.
to clarify.
Yeah, very true. Paul?
Like Wade, I've got to bail out and head to a public clamor commission. I agree with the comments, that the sentiment that there's very little value in what we hear at these planning commission meetings and often at city council meetings. One thing that we've been facing over the last few years in Salt Lake City, where we have terrible conditional use ordinances,
Thank you.
is that there's I've seen a shift in the way that people look at their local government, and there's a high level of distrust. And I have my planners and myself being accused of being in some sort of a nefarious relationship with developers.
Yeah.
And I think that this, and I struggle with this because I do think that 99% of the public comment that I'm gonna hear tonight is gonna be absolutely useless. And it's, you know, bring a bingo card, you're right. But I think that if we tell the public, we don't wanna hear you at all,
Right.
this pressure that continues to be put on our planners and other public servants, where there are these baseless accusations of, you know, you're on the take, you have some improper relationship, and you're making these decisions without public input. You know, because you're bad people, you know, and if they saw that, you know, my planner's driving a Kia, not a Ferrari, then they might, you know, reconsider these stupid accusations. But I think that somehow we need to strike a balance between letting the public vent a little bit, and making it useful. And I don't know if that includes, I've thought a long time, is there some way we can actually educate the public? And I'm at the point where I'm beyond hope. I don't think that but I think that maybe at planning commission meetings, we can state it out loud. It's gonna help you if you state something that is factual and that is standards-based, as opposed to the things that people are putting on the bingo card. With that, I they gotta.
Yeah, and that's a really good point, and, you know, and the point I would make to some of that is, oftentimes, if we just do the public hearing kind of thing like we normally tend to do, with the idea of let the public have their say, but we don't give them some context or background into it, then when they come and they say their piece, and then the commissioner, the land use authority is their acting at that point says, okay, well, thanks for your comments, now we have to go ahead and approve this, and they go ahead and make the motion and they approve it. What do you think the taste is of the citizens then? They're like, those dirty buggers, they never listened to us anyway, they're all on the tape, they knew this was gonna be approved from the very beginning. And so then what have you accomplished, you know? So there's gotta be some context and some.
I
if you're
agree,
gonna do
it's,
that.
there's a tug of war there over, they think they haven't been heard as opposed to they didn't get an opportunity to
Yeah.
be heard. So
Yeah.
there's gotta be some way to massage that.
Absolutely. Jason?
So, I worked in a community in Idaho that, I mean, this was a real big issue, and one of the ways that we addressed it was really ramping up the neighborhood meeting requirements, and so that education has to happen. There's two aspects to that education. One is the education of the project, and two is the education of the process. And the education of the process, I think, can happen in planning commission. That's completely appropriate. But as was just talked about, where there's this perspective that staff is favorable to the project or on the take of the project, comes with the education of the project in the planning commission meeting. If you separate that out and allow the neighborhood meeting, allow the developer to sit down with those neighbors, to hear what's going on, and help clarify the process, that the opportunity to be heard directly about the project, the one that can make the biggest difference is talking directly to the developer from the beginning, and then those changes being incorporated. That's a vital aspect, so that they are being heard. It also helps when you come to the planning commission meeting, that they actually have something of substance to share. They are familiar with the project. They're not sitting there and be like, well, this is the first time I've ever heard, or this is the first I've seen this project.
Yeah.
Those are my favorite comments.
Yeah.
Is
Yeah.
when they're just being exposed to it.
Right.
And so I think there is an opportunity for the public to be involved, but it may be bifurcating, separating those processes and that education piece out.
Yeah, good point. Yes.
Yeah, so just to segue off of Jason's comment, years and years ago, I saw one of the best planning commission meetings ever, and I wasn't their city attorney, I was just an observer, but it was Harrisville, and they have a small 10 or 12 lot subdivision, and there were three main public comments, and one was, a guy said, hey, there's an old abandoned water line here, and another guy said, hey, there's a spring,
Yeah.
and it's right in the middle of the footprint of this one lot, and another guy said, do you realize that all the stormwater pools where you've got this other lot? Well, based on those comments, the developer ripped out the abandoned line, rearranged the lots so that the spring was now in a lot line, not in the middle of the lot, and rearranged the storm water ponds so it was in a location where the water naturally went. And I just wanted to
Yeah.
stand up and say hallelujah, you know,
Yeah.
because that's how a good public hearing works. You're collecting information from the public. But I think it was because there was a neighborhood meeting first. Those people were informed, and then they were able to give good information based upon what they already did.
Yeah. Good point. Good point.
The other point I was going to make is I work for West Jordan City right now, and for the whole 6.5 years I've been there, we have a public hearing at the preliminary level for a subdivision site plan. But once it goes to final,
Right.
public is out, planning commission's
Yeah.
out, it's all staff, and it works great.
And I think that's kind of what's being talked about
Yeah.
at this point. Chris, you were gonna say, and then.
Yeah, I wasn't gonna say anything, because this is, I get a little worked up about this issue, but I cannot disagree anymore with the idea that you should have a neighborhood meeting. Could not disagree more. These community councils have become weaponized. And that article you put up about the Come and Go and Sugar House, that's because the Sugar House Community Council has been weaponized. So has the Greater Avenues Community Council, and the Yale Crest Community Council. You go to these neighborhood meetings, you tell them what's going on, and literally the first thing they do is they figure out a way to kill your project. Same thing happened, we had some neighborhood meetings in Sandy, on a piece of property. A bunch of neighbors got together, went to the city council to look for a way to write an ordinance around a development agreement so that they could prohibit something that was approved in the development agreement. It was all because a bunch of neighbors got weaponized. So everything that Will said before about older and richer and whiter, they have the time, they have the means, and they have the desire to be NIMBYs, and they use the public process to oppose people's property rights. And there's a balance between those ordinances and everything else, people's property rights. If you look at the purpose section of LUPA, it says you balance all those things, but then you weigh it on the property rights. That's what's in the Constitution. City rights are not in the Constitution. Zoning isn't there. You have to weigh, you have to balance it in favor of the property owner. But these public hearings have become, especially these community council meetings, in Salt Lake County in particular, have become an absolute nightmare, an absolute joke.
All right, thanks. Jamie, and then.
I don't say this very often, but I agree with Chris.
You say that all the time, Jamie. You say that all the time, man.
I think if we head down the path of really treating subdivisions, for example, as a true administrative process, then we need to rethink this whole idea of a neighborhood meeting and the introduction of some sort of legislative function into it. I mean, to some degree, it's almost like a do-it-yourself mugging. We're saying, no, this is an administrative process, but we're gonna have a neighborhood meeting, and we're gonna invite people to come and complain, and they're gonna say, well, what's my outlet to voice my concern? You say, this is it, and it ends here. And then they get frustrated.
Yeah.
And then they talk to elected officials, and then the elected officials or planning commissioners will say, well, this isn't working. We now need to turn it into a legislative process. So I agree. I think it's good to answer questions and address concerns. To some degree, though, it doesn't provide an outlet for them in a way to reinforce the idea that this is an administrative process. This is not a legislative process.
Let's go, take one more comment, and then I'm gonna move on, because we gotta get a couple of other things done, and then we can still talk, hopefully.
Is there maybe a concern that, and while I agree with the process and what you're doing, is there a concern that this just kind of pushes that public clamor to the city council level in the soon-to-be mandated public comment section, and with the added accusation that we're lacking transparency?
Yeah, good point. All right, let me just, and I apologize, but hopefully we'll get to some of these other things, but I want to go back now to, Jamie kind of mentioned this, but to the legislative hearings, all right? I mean, that's, like we said, it's a different kind of a beast, but that's not without its issues too. And there are some concerns there. This is from a group called Flash Vote. It's a company that jurisdictions, entities can hire to do a public polling for them on particular issues or whatever it is they're looking for. But they did an interesting study. They went back on a couple of hundred of their projects that they had done and took a look out on projects where they did surveys of the community, and they very much represent that they do scientifically valid surveys, statistically valid surveys of the community. And then they compared them to comments that were made in public hearings on the same issue that they had done surveys about, if they were holding public hearings as well, or public comments. And here's, the first one is really the most interesting one. Make decisions based on the public intimate set vote. What that says is that the public comment that was received in 70% of the cases was different or opposed to what they had gathered in the scientifically valid survey. So what that basically says again was the people that have showed up to do the public hearing are not representative of the community overall. They pretty much have a particular side that they're representing. And this kind of goes through that. And you know, we talk about that in terms of doing our general plans or things like that. That's great, we want community input, but how are we getting that community input? And what are we getting? Are we really getting a representation of what the community really thinks or feels or needs? And that's part of the concern here. I'm gonna skip over this slide. You're welcome to take a look at this, but just highlighted in red, the interests of future residents and renters are underrepresented in the planning process because they're never part of your survey. They're never part of your public comment period because they don't live there yet. or they may not be that well represented. And so that's something to keep in mind as we go through this. So with this, I'm going to turn it over to Paul Allred. Paul has pretty much said that he decided to retire when he had enough of public hearings. And so he's going to talk a little bit about that, and then hopefully we'll have a few minutes to take a few more comments.
Yeah, that is essentially true. I did burn out. I'm probably the only person in this state who was, I don't know, I was paid staff to work for community councils 30 years ago. So I have a unique perspective on public clamor. Salt Lake City had an association of community councils back in the day, SLAC. I think it still exists, but I'm not so sure how well it was funded. Anyway, I worked in the mayor's office, but I was kind of persona non grata. If you think about it, I represented the neighborhood groups to talk to the city about land use issues. That was a bit awkward. You talk about going to work every day and feeling stressed. Going up to the planning department was like, oh, they were never in. Oh, Paul, we don't want to talk to Paul. Why? I mean, the city was trying to create a way to have a liaison with the neighborhoods, a land use liaison with the neighborhoods, with the staff. Well, it was an impossible position. So after 2.5 years, I just said, man, I can't work for people who, they have a one word vocabulary, and it's no. Every positive thing the city proposed, every land use proposal that was proposed was opposed by the neighborhood groups, no matter how worthy it was of support. No matter how worthy it was, even talking to the planners. And after a while, I found myself going to these land use meetings and all these committee meetings, knowing that I was just completely opposed to the people I'm supposed to be working for because they were completely irrational. So that was kind of the start of my career. I worked for San Jose City before that, doing code enforcement, which is a whole nother way of dealing with irrational people who don't want to clean up their yards. And, you know. But that was a great experience for me. But I wanted to just touch on that. I've written some articles in the APA newsletter. Some of you may have read them if you haven't. If you want to know more of my perspective on public hearings, I've written 2 or 3 articles, and they're called Clamor is King. And it's just one man's perspective on how broken the system is. Our public hearing system is horrifically broken. It is, I venture to say, I believe it's irretrievably broken, because I don't know that there's will power between the cities and people to be rational. And with COVID, I knew the last few years when I was working in Holladay, we couldn't have a rational discussion with people about things that were as obvious as the nose on your face. I went out and we were doing doing some input on trails that people are already using, de facto trails that were going throughout all the neighborhoods, all these canals. Out in Holladay, you've got these canals, and we were out talking to people about, hey, maybe we should formalize these, get some little small security lights, some signage. I've never seen such visceral reaction and hypocrisy. People that were using them, that lived by them, were violently opposed to anybody having access to them, even though there was ground that they didn't know. I mean, that's when you just kind of go, we've reached the bottom, the nadir of public behavior here. So we gave up on that. We thought we had a real opportunity to create walking paths, a system where people could see each other, socialize, just make it part of our park system. No, it was, people were, so ugly, the comments. I can't even, I ventured to say some of the comments, if I told you, you literally wouldn't believe them. I'll mention one. This one guy said, we should stop this whole public trails process because people are gonna come to from Portland, and they're gonna hold their meetings. They're gonna, from Portland and Seattle, they're gonna come down and they're gonna hold us hostage. They're gonna have meetings on these trails, and they're gonna damage our properties. I was like, people from Portland are gonna come to Holladay. I mean, COVID did something to people's brains. It really did. I mean, these are, and here's another thing about public clamor. Have you noticed that people who are brilliant in their public life, they're dentists, lawyers, doctors, I mean, you name it, people high caliber, well-to-do, they turn into blithering idiots when it comes to land use. they literally have no common sense at all. They will make statements that are so bizarre, and you go, I can't believe that you ever reached a level of proficiency in your professional life over here, and you come out and you sound like a fourth grader. I mean, no, actually, fourth graders would sound a lot better than some of this. But here's my take. A lot of the administrative hearings that we have are this. I'm not gonna read each one of these, but I think most of you would agree that this is the case. We, in our efforts to and by the way, I love people. I went into planning because I really love the idea of, placemaking and, kumbaya moments, and those are few and far between in planning, and they shouldn't be. But they often are because we shoot ourselves in the foot. We create processes where we say, we want people to be informed. I am big on public input. I love people come out and talk about stuff. But, after, I think about 2,500 public meetings is how many nights I spent away from my wife and kids. And so many thousands of hours listening to people making no sense at all. And I thought, why am I doing this? Why am I doing this? This is insanity. We are holding hearings that are unnecessary, that are expensive, that are misleading, that are time consuming. Why are we holding a public hearing on a 3-lot subdivision? Why? Isn't that silly? Somebody's got a 1 acre lot and they want to turn it into 3, and it's all got their regular zoning. It meets zoning. We're not even going for a rezone. And we tell them to come out and comment on a little 3-lot division. People go ape. It's like they already have the zoning. Why did you, and then when we don't turn it down as a planning commission, or we don't recommend against it as staff, what do? You're not listening. You don't care. You're a developer. I remember one time somebody was chewing me out one day out in the field. You're on the ticket, and I said, really, would I put my 30 years of public service on the line? Would I risk my reputation over a 1-lot subdivision, sir? Really? Okay, that shut that guy up. He finally went, you're right. But I'm serious. As a public employee, I got fed up with being so beaten up over stuff that was so unnecessary. And this is what city government does. So we, as planners, I'm telling you, we have an obligation. This is just touching the surface of so many things I want to put together and write about. So many countless instances, but look carefully at this. We are our own worst enemy as public servants. And I mean that in a kind way, because I know a lot of you have been in the same boat that I was. You're suffering, you're hurting, but why? Look at this. If we fail to do this as staff, okay, we do a disservice to our employer and to the public we work for, okay? How many planners are out there, you watch them in a meeting, and they're so terrified, they don't understand the mechanics of the issue they're dealing with. They don't understand the rules of how to run a public meeting. They don't understand how to make motions and how the planning commission may be doing wrong. And the planning commissioners, bless their hearts, they don't know who's really training their planning commission. Every time I got a new planning commissioner, I begged him to come in my office, and I'd sit down with him and I'd say, ask me any question you want. Let me help you understand how this process works. How many of you here are actively involved in hiring, in interviewing incoming planning commissioners? That's it? Your city does not allow you to have input as staff into who's coming onto your planning commission? Oh my gosh, this is worse than I thought. Okay, I'm so glad that the last 2 employers I had let me be involved in the process, and they let me suggest names. I went out and I recruited people in the community that had come to public hearings and had made some semblance of rationality, and I recruited them to be on the planning commission because I wanted to have a planning commission that wasn't going to literally dump on every single recommendation I made because they're terrified of the public. This is crazy what we're doing. This is literally insane what we're doing. You guys as staff need to have more input on who's on your planning commission. You need to ask for that input to say, I'm going to be working with these people. It shouldn't just all be political, who's on your planning commission, because they oftentimes have an agenda. People who go to the mayor and council and say, I want to be on the planning commission, they got an axe to grind. They're telling neighbors, so we're going to stop growth and development. Let me get on the planning commission. Then what is staff? You're stuck with people who are hostile to you before they've even made one vote on the planning commission. Okay, as staff, we have to have more control, we have to have more input, you have to ask for it, beg for it, demand it, because this is what's happening. You have to be a staff, be willing to make, do you have the courage to make recommendations you know won't be popular with your planning commission, with the public? I mean, let's admit it, do you sit there and write staff reports at 2 in the morning? Anybody done that? Nobody here's done a staff report at 2 in the morning? What?
8-3.
Yeah. On Centerville, I used to sleep in my office. I'd have 9 public hearings and 13 items, but with 9 public hearings and all the paperwork and everything, impossible to take a good night's rest. Okay? This is a problem, is when you have too much work to do and you don't know what you're doing, you've got to get trained on this stuff, and you better have courage, because you're gonna get inundated with more and more work over the years if you don't train your planning commissioners. They need to know where you're coming from, and the people above you, your council members, your city managers, your planning directors. They need to be your advocates for making sure that you've got a good planning commission. Bad planning commission equals bad decisions. So, I'm telling you this, this is the unvarnished truth, and I could go much deeper, but as staff, you can be your own worst enemy unless you decide to do the last one, which is to lead. Planning staff has to have the courage to lead, and that means in meetings, speaking up. Any of you here speak up and say, oh man, I had planning commissioners that got so irritated with me over the years because I would educate in the meeting. I would talk about, well, here's the latest trend, here's what's going on, we might want to think about this. Oh, in this chapter, do you remember this decision we made? I'm telling you what, that's really helpful for planning commissioners to have their staff educating them as they go along. Do you guys have pre-meetings with your planning commission? Do you have dinner with them before? Do you have bi-monthly or quarterly meetings with your planning commission and talk about how things are going? Yes?
And I'm sure you know, the statute was changed a year or 2 ago with required training for the planning commission. That's made a tremendous difference. And so they will turn to me during the meeting, and they'll often know the answer, but they'll ask a question, and what they're trying to do is educate the audience. What, Mr. Simonson, what is your discretion? What is our discretion on this decision?
Yeah.
Well, they know very well, but they're trying to educate the 20, 25 people in the room that, and basically have me tell them and take the heat for them, which I'm glad to do, that they got no discretion, that they've got to decide in favor of this.
I know we're out of time and I could go on, but as you can tell, I'm more than passionate about this because of the drastic impacts it has on the future going forward. I mean, you constantly, if you're a staff and you're a planning commission and a council that constantly kicks decisions down the road, you kick that can down the road, it's completely irresponsible. So fix your planning commission. Be courageous, okay? And this is all in the stuff. I encourage you to read these. I put a lot of thought into NIMBYism and the negative impacts of NIMBYism. It's worse than we think when you see decisions that are made again and again and what the long-term effects are. So, all right, we're out of time. I could talk for hours on this. I've had 10 minutes or so. Any question for me? Because I've got endless advice for people on how to avoid this. Yeah,
I have a question for you and Wilf on the potential changes to state law that Wade was talking about earlier, subdivision process. As a developer, I dealt with some cities where they would require you to go to a meeting 2 weeks before the regular meeting, before a council or a planning commission meeting, and it was required.
yeah.
So you had to build that into your timeline process. Would these changes potentially address that?
Let's come up and talk, it might, but I think there's plenty of pushback back to you, so come up and let's talk about it on the record. So folks, thanks. The real solution, the public input is involve the public, get them involved in the process, to help them understand. And especially if we're working on the state bodies. All right, thanks so much. We're here to talk you out.